we're going to take a sample and not bring it back necessarily, but analyze it there and try to see what's out there. I mean, wouldn't it be amazing? Like in the best case scenario, if we bring along a microscope, and we actually see little cells moving around.
A live stream of the cells moving around in the atmosphere of Venus. What's up, you scholars of enlightenment? Today we have a very, very special Bad Boy Meets, because we're going to be discussing the fascinating finding of a potential chemical marker of biology in the atmosphere of Venus. And to help us unravel the nature, the importance and the implications of this observation, we welcome to the channel Professor Sara Seager. So Professor Seager, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much for taking the time. I know you must be very busy at the moment. So Professor Seager is the class of 1941 Professor of Planetary Science. She's a Professor of Physics, a Professor of Aeronautics and Astronautics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And her past research is credited with laying the foundation for the field of exoplanet atmospheres, while her current research focuses on exoplanet atmospheres and the future search for signs of life by way of atmospheric biosignature gases. So who better to help guide us through this intriguing result as one of the authors on the recent paper on the Venusian atmosphere findings. So Professor Seager, before we get into Venus, the serious stuff, I can't have you on. It would be remiss of me not to ask you about another topic. So an aside straight away, but you were a scientific expert on the show Ancient Aliens, which is a show that me and my friends very much enjoyed watching while we were in Cambridge.
Okay.
Perhaps not for the scientific merit, but more for the way they took a nugget of science and then expanded it out wildly to some potential suggestion.
If you look at the Ben stone, sometimes it is described or depicted with people coming out of this stone. Now, to me, this looks very similar to a lunar module.
How did you find yourself on that show, and how did you enjoy being the scientific expert on Ancient Aliens?
All right. Well, I have to say that I started on the show at the very first pilot.
Yeah.
Where they assured me they were interviewing half proponents, half opponents.
Okay. For
a balanced view.
Yeah.
I know that's hard to believe, but that's what they did. I believe they did interview all those people. But when I watched the pilot, it was, 97% proponents of the ancient alien theory, and then 3% me and one other person who were on for about 30 seconds. So I interviewed for the show for a while until one of my students just said, he almost basically said he was ashamed to see me on the show. So I thought, okay, I better reevaluate here. So I gave it one last go.
Yeah.
Where when they asked me a question, I said everything all in one breath so they couldn't cut and paste. And then at some point later, I saw the show and they still cut it off.
Yeah.
So they would say, well, actually, no, I don't really have a great example, but yeah, so I'm not on the show now. But what I would do is if someone, an esteemed colleague, a scientist or anyone in science, such as yourself, would say, wow, why are you on this show? I'd say, why are you watching it?
Exactly. So there's no clean hands in the plague pit. No, we used to enjoy it a lot, but it would be like a sensible discussion about how gold is useful in space travel or something, which, is perfectly acceptable scientific point. It's reflective, it's conductive, perfectly acceptable scientific point. But then suddenly, 2 seconds later, you're talking about that means an alien civilization came to Earth and created alien human hybrids to mine gold for their spaceships.
Right. So they would ask me, so what do you think about gold? And I would say, well, gold is very useful on Earth because, and then they would cut it off at gold is very useful, and it would just sort of cut off. So, yeah. So I'm not on the show now, so the one good thing about it is I'll always look much younger forever because you do sign away the rights, obviously, of everything they're filming, so they can recycle over and over again. So if you see me today, it's from, many years ago. So that's the nice thing.
Amazing.
Always preserved young.
Very, 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 very interesting. No, I love the way they used to just take that nugget of science and then suddenly you were away in fantasy by some very, very loose link
Right. But to their credit, they started out with the best intentions to really think about the ancient alien theory itself, and really, interview historians, as well as the people who love the theory, people who have reasons against it, and they did really start out. But I think it just took a life of its own.
I think people enjoyed watching it more for like we did, in a sort of ironic, this is crazy and kooky way, and maybe the audience ended up deciding the direction.
I know. Well, do you think that the majority of the people are watching it not for entertainment value, but because they really love it and they take it seriously? Yeah.
Do you think so? I mean, we used to watch it for. How do you think that breaks down? Because we were watching it for the fun aspect and the crazy aspect of it. Do you think most people watch it? It is on the History Channel, which is a bit awkward.
Right. I do. That was my sense, actually. I mean, I don't have real evidence for you on that, but my sense was like the majority really do believe.
Interesting. So it's
once, by the way, once I heard from Giorgio himself. He actually reached out to me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did he? You can't leave that just as is. You've got to expand that for us if you can.
Yes. Well, it was really a very nice exchange. He actually asked me a question on relativity.
Oh, okay.
And although I forget special relativity, I'm sure you've taken class in that, or you could we could all, if you've done an undergraduate in physics, you can kind of go Wikipedia level and explain it to people.
Yeah.
He mostly wanted to know, and I know you know the answer to this, but how fast you have to travel, how close to the speed of light would one have to travel to have all the special effects happen, like time dilation and things like that.
Yeah.
And when I explained it to him, like I may have put the formula and I showed a graph and then I explained it in words. He was genuinely surprised.
The gamma graph, which is going up.
Right. You have to be incredibly close to the speed of light, like so close it's not really feasible in any way.
Yeah.
And he accepted it, actually. He liked the reasoning and he thanked me and he said, wow, that's so helpful. And I think he got that you can't just sort of go fast. It has to be, wow, like not.
Well, that would explain why we didn't introduce those effects in the first instance, because they're obviously not speeds that we're used to dealing with. But he does come across, and most of the people on there come across as nice people. They don't come across as nasty people. Him in particular is he's sort of like a big teddy bear, he seems. And obviously now he's got his own meme, and it's taken as you say, it's taken on a life of its own.
Well, the show did really well for him. It really did. So, and Giorgio was like so good on camera. Yeah. And I feel like that had a lot to do with it, because the scientists they were interviewed this anthropologist. Everybody was so serious and academic-like, and that doesn't sell, Giorgio sells.
Yeah. And
so that's why I think partly why it took off a life of its own in the wrong direction.
Just because the sort of showmanship and the sort of memeability of it sort of took over. Showmanship
and that like really outgoingness, that's the personality of non-academics, and those who went in academia, a lot of us anyway, were just sort of more quiet and not really like, and I feel like, too serious and that. And so I feel like that helped a lot for that side, not just the hype or it was kind of a crazy thing. So I did it for a while, and then I tried, like I said, I honestly tried one last time. Make sure that whatever I said was not like, well, magnetic fields are, and
commonly associated with alien spacecraft visiting the Earth. Yeah, it's.
I feel after a while they sort of abused me, because like they took advantage of me in a way, because they needed the MIT professor. I was like the last holdout of anyone legit who would be on the show.
I remember there was yourself, and then was it a guy from UC Davis or a kind of.
Okay, he must have come later, but they need people from university just to sort of validate the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure I don't know if the show's still being made, but they recycled my material for so long because they can, right? They own that material. And that's why I was making that joke. Like, you'll understand later when you're way older, but it's funny when you're like, you're just young forever now, because that's.
No, it's we used to watch it, and it was just, like I say, we would be like, okay, that's really interesting. That's actually quite an interesting observation. Like, I'll have to look into that a little bit more. And then 30 seconds later, suddenly they're coming to get the gold from Pluto, because the Pluto is dying and they live in the heart of Pluto, and to mine the gold instead of using machines because they're so incredibly advanced to be able to get from Pluto, somehow they're using genetically engineered cows for some reason. It's just like, it just doesn't make any sense. Or like they're building monuments out of stone when they're so advanced. Obviously they've been using metal and electronics and such, but they decide to use stone for some unknown reason. I was just like this, but we enjoyed it just for the sort of the comedic value of it.
Glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad.
No, it was. I don't think there's certainly no reason to be ashamed. And as you say, you've told us that you went in with the best intentions, and And as you said, it's that friction, isn't it, between the serious
Right.
science and getting it out there to a wider audience. You have to do a little bit of showmanship and razzle dazzle, and unfortunately, it looks like that overtook the serious initial mission. Super. Thank you so much for going through that with me and sharing your experiences on that. So, the main event, the serious stuff. How on Earth, or that's probably a terrible pun there, or rather on Venus, could there be life on Venus? Because this is a planet that has a surface temperature of 460 degrees C, which could melt lead. It's got a pressure which is, 100 times the Earth? It's like being 1 kilometre under the sea. It's incredibly toxic, tons of CO2, sulfuric acid. The Soviet crafts that went there, these Venera crafts, they didn't last more than an hour before presumably the electronics melted or short-circuited in some way. How could we have life on Venus?
Well, first of all, it's still a really fringe theory. It's so not quite at the level of ancient aliens, but it's still really out there. And, the thought actually started with Carl Sagan over 50 years ago, that it's not on the surface itself where it's way too hot for any kind of life, but it's higher up. Just like, here on Earth, you hear about the hikers hiking up Mount Everest. It gets so cold up there, and there's so little air. So above the surface, way above the surface, at 50 kilometers or so, the temperature becomes much cooler. And it's actually it's a good temperature for life up in the clouds.
So I think it said 50 kilometers, the pressures drop, and then the temperature's about 30 to 80, which becomes much more like the Earth, I guess. And on the Earth, we have microbial life up in the clouds. There's 2 million tons of bacteria in the clouds. We've got fungal spores, microalgae, things like this. So it becomes...
It's true. And most people don't know that. I mean, I didn't know that a few years ago. I
didn't know that until I did the research for this talk.
Okay. Well, people don't. So let's just pause on that for a moment, because it's amazing. On Earth, life gets swept up from the surface and it floats around in the clouds. Some of it goes inside liquid droplets. It doesn't stay very long, though, maybe a week or so before it's rained back down. So on Venus, we're imagining something completely different, that the life stays up there basically forever.
So that's very interesting. So you say that. So on Earth, you'd imagine that it falls back down to the surface and you get some sort of cycling. Presumably, if these microbes, and you said there's a huge discrepancy between the conditions on the surface and the conditions in the clouds on Venus, presumably these microbes would therefore need to stay up, have some form of buoyancy. How would that work?
Well, we don't have a great idea for that. I did write a paper, though, that came out a few months ago. It took me a really long time to write this, because that was the question. Like, we didn't want the phosphine results to come out and then not have plugged at least one hole in the so-called, not even theory, right, but hypothesis. Right. So what I hypothesized was that there is a cycle, but they don't go down to the ground because they can't. Not all. But the idea is that because they'll be in these so-called, we're imagining that if there is life, it is inside the liquid droplets, and it's reproducing and metabolizing, but over time, these droplets grow because they're colliding. And over months to about a year or so, the droplets would get big enough and massive enough, they'd start to fall out of the atmosphere, right? So not quite like rain, like here on Earth, you can get pounded with rain, but, slowly falling. And my idea was that as they sink down, the droplets evaporate. Because it gets hotter and hotter.
So you get the convection cycle.
And they would leave behind a dried out spore, which would populate this lower haze layer that is actually very stable and not well understood. And they would kind of live there for a while, like hibernating, if you will, until they can get updrafted, and the cycle would begin again.
Amazing. Very, very interesting. I have to have a look at that paper. And I guess that buoyancy is easier on Venus, but if you've got this incredibly thick atmosphere, it's easier than on the Earth. Is that the case, or am I thinking too much into that?
Probably thinking too much. I mean, the cloud level is the same, similar temperature and pressure to Earth. But the problem is there are some layers in the atmosphere that don't have convection. They're very stable. And so it's a bit of a challenge to imagine how life can get back up.
Yeah, makes sense. So you still have the problem. So we talked about pressure and temperature there becomes more like the Earth as we go up to 50 kilometers. But you still have to deal with this highly toxic, highly acidic Venusian atmosphere. How could life survive there? And do we have examples of life surviving in those environments?
No. There's this phrase, it's not a perfect world. And we don't actually have a great answer for you here. There are, we love to almost brag about Earth life, how it's just so great and so diverse. We find it pretty much everywhere. almost in the driest places, in the most acidic places, the most salty places. But on Venus, it takes extreme environment to a whole new level.
Yeah.
This acidity, it's billions of times more acidic than the most acidic places on Earth.
Oh wow! So even looking at the extremophiles on Earth, the acidophiles on Earth, this would still be for them too extreme an environment for them to live in.
Exactly, and it's not only that, but our building blocks of our life, even those bacteria, wouldn't survive in sulfuric acid. They would break apart almost instantly. Yeah, it's a pretty tough environment.
Wow. So we're really out there with the idea that life could be there. It would be a new frontier for the ability of life to persist in this environment, even given what we see in places like magma vents on the Earth and things like that.
Right. Even, yeah, a new frontier.
Wow. So we talked about the life being up in the clouds in Venus. This begs a question to me, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but surely life didn't evolve in the clouds themselves? Did it evolve on the ground and migrate up? What's the best idea on that? Or did it evolve in situ? It seems odd to think about that life would have started above the surface without a sort of stable ground and maybe pools of water. This is the idea that we have on the Earth, or am I being too Earth-centric?
Right, we're all pretty Earth-centric, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Struggle. Well, the consensus is, and again, it's very hand-wavy, very speculative, but the kind of general thought is that life may have originated in an ocean back when Venus was more habitable. We think that Venus was cooler and had an ocean a long, long time ago, and that life might have originated there and migrated to the clouds and evolved over time.
Okay, so I was looking at some modelling where it said that there could have been 2 to 3 billion years where Venus had pools of water on the surface, and it only changed about 700 million years ago. What caused that change from Venus potentially being, and I saw a paper that you wrote last year about Venus potentially, this is again a hypothesis, but potentially being the first habitable world in our solar system. How did it go from that to what we see today, which is a very extreme environment, very hot, very pressurized, very toxic atmosphere for life? What was the transition there?
Yeah, there's two things. One idea is that, well, first of all, Venus is closer to our sun, and it's in a much more kind of fragile position.
Yeah.
So its atmosphere started heating up, and something pushed Venus over the edge.
Yeah.
Just like a person, is maybe about to have a nervous breakdown, and there's that one last thing that makes them become unglued. And on Venus, it could have been one of two things. Like, if it happened a long time ago, it was, our sun, it started out cooler, and over time, it's been getting bigger and warmer.
Yeah.
And some people think that it just got bigger and warmer enough just to heat up Venus just a little more so that its oceans started evaporating.
Yeah.
And water is our most potent greenhouse gas. And as more water went in the atmosphere, it got hotter and hotter, and then even more water evaporated, and it just was this very crazy runaway effect. Exactly. And eventually that water got split up by ultraviolet photons from the sun, and the hydrogen escaped to space.
Yeah.
I think in that paper, but I'm not 100% sure, they said it could have been a volcanic outburst, like something could have happened and made and that could have also put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and just sent the planet over that tipping point for the runaway.
So I think the hypothesis they have in that paper is that because there's no plate tectonics on Venus, the heat inside the planet built up to such an extent couldn't escape, and then you hit this tipping point, a huge volcanic event essentially happened, and a resurfacing episode, I think they call it, and essentially it was ripped apart. You had all these gases spewed into the atmosphere, and as you say, it ran away and very quickly changed it from a potentially habitable planet to what we see today. So what is the history, before we get into the results that you found, what is the history of looking for life on Venus? Because you talked about Carl Sagan posited life could exist there, I guess in the sort of, when was he around, the 70s sort of period, was that?
Yeah, late 1960s, early 70s.
1960s, 70s. Why have we not seen much interest in this area, or have we, but we just haven't found anything?
Well, we haven't seen a lot of really kind of hard research on this. I was really surprised when I wrote my paper on the life cycle hypothesis. I was really surprised that, because I thought it was a kind of out there paper, but a number of people in the Venus community said, wow, that was a real tour de force, because there was a lot of equations there and a lot of descriptions of physics.
Yeah.
And I think most of because I tried to describe how it could go up, how it would go down, what are the timescales.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the papers on the search for life are just very qualitative, and they're not really with anything solid. Also, I'm not sure why, but there was a heyday for Venus in the 80s and maybe into the early 90s when we sent spacecraft. Russia sent a whole bunch of them. Yeah. Landers and balloons and everything.
Actually, great excitement throughout the entire Soviet Union when the nation's greatest space achievement was announced. A soft landing on Venus had been accomplished, and the equipment that was Earth's first surface link with a mysterious planet was working well. These pictures have been released to Pathé News by the Russian authorities and show their scientists making final adjustments and tests to the actual equipment which successfully covered the multi-million miles to the distant planet. Here, Russian space technicians submitted the vehicle to rigorous tests to simulate blast-off and landing. As the day of launching neared, the scientists stepped up their program in final preparation for the major assault on the shrouded planet. This is an animated reconstruction of how the Russian Venus probe looked in deep space. On Earth, listening posts, including Jodrell Bank, kept in constant touch. It was an achievement of space technology which rightly earned international acclaim for Russia and opened new space frontiers.
Kind of not really sure why it hasn't had a lot of attention. I do know there's a lot of people in the Venus community who have been working hard for quite a while to get missions back to Venus.
It does seem that, I was wondering if there was, I've got some ideas of why it might be, but I was wondering whether it was a US versus Russia thing, because it seems that the US tended more towards Mars. And the Russians are the only ones who went to Venus. So I wonder if there's a political element there. And then sort of going further into the sort of scientific ways of looking at that, I just wonder if it's an idea of probability and funding. So we look at Mars and people talk about there's potentially water on the surface and it looks more maybe like the Earth. And is it just that there's a limited amount of funding and it seems more probable to us with an Earth-centric idea that life will be on Mars? So not a lot of focus went into Venus. Maybe that's the reason. And you actually put out a paper last year, I believe it was last year. You're involved in this research to begin looking for biogas signatures in exoplanet atmospheres and not be so essentially oxygen focused. So this
right.
This was a phosphine paper. Was it last year that you put that out? Which is quite prescient now.
Because you've been working in science yourself, and you understand that if you see a paper, well, depending on where it comes from, but it may have been years in the making. And so we started working on that in 2015. I had this giant chemoinformatics project where we're trying to consider all molecules, anything that would be in gas form, as a potential biosignature gas. Yeah. And phosphine was one of the first ones that we looked at. It was kind of amazing, actually, because since my team was working on phosphine, we had a few different papers on it. A mutual contact connected us with Professor Jane Greaves' team. Yeah. Oh, wow. Because she had already found the kind of somewhat low significance detection with the first telescope she used. And then our teams connected and we worked together. So it seems kind of strange, but a weird coincidence, I think, that two separate groups were working on what really is a completely niche, obscure gas and topic.
So what was the key finding that gave away that life may inhabit the clouds of Venus? What is this finding that's got such fanfare over the last week or so?
Well, we detected phosphine gas in the atmosphere of Venus. Yep. And the phosphine is coming from that same 50 to 60 kilometer level where the temperatures are right for life. Yep. So it's pretty amazing. That's kind of interesting. But where it comes from is, phosphine, it's a phosphorus atom attached to 3 hydrogen atoms. And there's not a lot of hydrogen on Venus. You don't expect that molecule to be present. You should have a phosphorus attached to some oxygen atoms. Yeah. So it's very hard to make phosphine, and it's very hard for phosphine to survive. Yep. So sort of right off, you don't have to give it too much thought and just say, wow, that gas shouldn't be there.
So I just want to, before we get into the implications of it and where it came from, how was it discovered? So you found this absorption feature for the chemical phosphine. So light essentially is shining towards us and it's missing the frequencies where phosphine likes to absorb light. This was a 15 sigma detection, so we can be pretty sure that we've seen phosphine. I'm just thinking about how that measurement was made. So how was that measurement made? And the light that's coming, is it light from the sun that goes through the atmosphere of Venus and then we see it?
Sure, good question.
Because
Yeah.
presumably, if that's the case, you can only take these measurements at a certain time when there's a...
Yeah, that's not the case, actually.
Not the case. Okay, good.
No. This was taken by 2 different radio telescopes working at very long wavelengths, millimeter wavelengths, in fact. And what happens is sunlight hits Venus. A lot of it's reflected from the clouds, but some of it goes down and hits the surface or goes deeper in the atmosphere. And that radiation is absorbed and it's effectively reprocessed.
Yeah.
So eventually it has to go back out because, in the atmosphere, there's a conservation of energy. No new energy is created, no energy is destroyed. So, what comes in must go out.
Yep.
And some radiation comes out at these very long wavelengths.
Makes sense.
And so the planet might appear to be shining in the radio, but it's all reprocessed sunlight.
Yeah.
And that's the light source.
Now I'm with you. So we don't need that alignment at all. We can take these measurements all of the time. And it was missing, that reprocessed light was missing these frequencies at which phosphine likes to absorb light. And we found that with the ALMA and the JCMT telescopes, as you say, in the sub-millimeter range. So how could the presence of phosphine indicate, as you sort of started going into and alluding to, why could the presence of phosphine indicate the presence of life on Venus? How is phosphine usually produced here on the Earth, and what inference are we making, therefore, about Venus?
Well, here on Earth, phosphine is only associated with life.
Yep.
Either bacterial life in oxygen-free environments, like swamps or wetlands or inside animal guts.
Nice.
Above penguin colonies. So it's made by humans too, as a pesticide. Was used it's very harmful for any life that uses oxygen.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean it's life on Venus. The team really worked hard to look through so many other avenues to produce phosphine. Yeah. Volcanoes or meteorites falling into the atmosphere, or lightning or chemistry. And we didn't find anything that produces phosphine that matches the amount that we've observed. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't some unknown chemistry or there's some reaction that we hadn't thought of.
Yeah.
But it's definitely suspicious.
So it would be an unknown if it was something producing that.
Well, the thing is that it's hard to predict every last thing because, when you have a chemical reaction, something reacts with something else. But those reactants, we don't know how much there is.
Yeah.
Because we haven't measured everything in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
But we do have a new word for you. I don't know if you'll find this funny or not.
Yeah.
David Grinspoon invented it for us. Okay. It's called chemsplaining. So we have this term that's become very popular called mansplaining because typically poor, quieter people, like women especially, say something at a conference, is completely ignored, and then a man will just say it more loudly and aggressively, and then it's, wow, that's a great thing, great idea. So it turns out that what happened since we published this is everyone is writing to us or posting on social media. It's this. Yeah. Wikipedia says, this can make phosphine. It's like, well, that's Wikipedia. And then even, anyone from the most renowned scientist, astronaut, down to just your person on the street is writing to us. And it's been so much, we can't even respond because we've just been bombarded by this chemsplaining.
So when something cool comes along, every scientist thinks they can be a new expert in that. So I remember seeing when the coronavirus curves came out, all the physicists fitting exponentials to them and the epidemiologists sort of going crazy. I
actually forgot about that. That's really true.
Yeah.
Right. So, even some of my astrophysics friends published papers.
Yeah. And the epidemiologist, I was talking to an epidemiologist, he was going crazy because obviously, even though they're making sensible points most of the time, they don't understand all the variables that are required because they're not in that field, which, is not their fault, but they should probably take a little bit more time before going in gun ho.
Some people came to our defense, including one who said, this is all great and everything, so why don't you take your idea, write a paper, submit it to a peer-reviewed journal, just like the authors did. So
exactly, that's probably the right way to go. So if we're certain we found phosphine, this is a 15 sigma detection, and phosphine is a biosignature, as we know it is here on the Earth, why can't we say that we found life? Because even in this paper, and as you've said to us very clearly, the presence of phosphine is unexplained despite exhaustive study of steady state chemistry and photochemical pathways here on the Earth. And there's currently, with no currently known abiotic production routes in Venus's atmosphere, cloud surface, subsurface, or from lightning, volcanic, or meteoric delivery. So you looked at a lot of ways of producing this. You couldn't produce it. So why can we still not, for the layman, say we've got life on Venus?
Because we haven't completely proven that there's absolutely no other way to produce phosphine.
Yeah.
That's why.
So
just to put it in perspective,
yeah,
if there is life in the Venus atmosphere, it's so completely crazy. It's so beyond anything our little brains can handle.
yeah,
It's just insane. But we feel like so is some other chemistry.
yeah.
So we're kind of left with two crazy ways to explain.
So so it's either life or it's some unknown chemistry, which
some very obscure, very unlikely chemical reaction that isn't really articulated yet.
Which I guess is good, right? We would prefer it from an excitement angle to be the life. But if it's not, it's some new chemistry. So it is new science that we've discovered regardless. So it's still a very interesting discovery in and of itself.
Right. And I think it would be, if it's true there is a non-life pathway, I don't know, some of us may breathe a sigh of relief because the world isn't so crazy after all.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's just so hard for us to imagine life on Venus.
Yeah. Interesting. Wait, well, yeah, I guess so. So life becomes an even more complicated thing, and the number of things we'd have to look for probably increases hugely, which probably changes a lot of the Bayesian priors, as we'll come on to, for the probability of life on other planets, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So what are the next steps? So we've got this paper. As we said, there's been great fanfare, very, very interesting result, regardless of whether it's life or not. What are the next steps that we need to go through, your team needs to go through, to clean this up and be able to get a resolution to this issue of whether there's life on Venus or not? What should we be looking to do?
There's short-term and long-term. In the short term, we'll welcome everyone to write their own papers on abiotic pathways that might explain phosphine. I know a lot of people now will be trying to make follow-up observations, not just on our team, but a lot of other people in the community using ALMA itself to confirm, as well as infrared telescopes on the ground, or maybe even the airborne SOFIA observatory. It's going to be tricky because phosphine has very weak infrared features where those observatories operate. So that's the short term, just repeating what
confirming the data and getting independent verification of the same result.
Right, and looking at through the chemistry, so kind of more of the same. The really exciting follow-up would take longer, but that would be to go to Venus, to send a probe there, to drop into the atmosphere, and in the best case scenario, send a balloon, which can float around for days to weeks to months, and collect and do some analysis.
How technologically viable is such a process? Were the Russians doing similar things back in the day? So this is something we could do?
We could do it. The Russians sent 2 balloons to Venus in the 1980s, and these balloons were coated with Teflon. So the sulfuric acid droplets, wouldn't make a hole in the balloon. And they lasted for about 2 days each, and they measured all sorts of things. So we have to do that again, but with our more modern, more sophisticated instruments.
Wow. So it is possible for us to be able to go there and actually, and maybe, as you say, this will be longer term because it obviously takes a lot of time to get the funding and get the technology ready to do that. But maybe that's the only way we're going to get a finite answer to this problem, because we're making inferences. Eventually, to get that final confirmation, even if we've shut off as many pathways as we can, we're still going to have to go there and take a sample.
Right. We're going to take a sample and not bring it back necessarily, but analyze it there and try to see what's out there. I mean, wouldn't it be amazing? Like in the best case scenario, if we bring along a microscope, and we actually see little cells moving around.
A live stream of the cells moving around in the atmosphere of Venus.
Yeah.
That would be absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
So if we go into what would be, because I touched on it very briefly there, what would be and this leans on the work that you do in a wider sense. What would be the implications of finding life in the clouds of Venus? Because we've got life obviously here on the Earth, but we haven't found life anywhere else so far. and then we look to our nearest solar system neighbor and we find, oh, there's life there. Does that really change our sort of the Bayesian priors of how probable life is? Or are there other explanations as to why this idea of panspermia, that there might have been contamination between Venus and Earth, and really this wouldn't be an independent, start for life? What would be the implications?
Right. Well, if we could, if there is life on Venus, and we could show that it's completely different from our own life, and somehow demonstrate it had an independent origin, then yes, it would change everything for us, because it would mean that life originated a second time, and therefore it must be relatively easy for life to originate, and thus that more bodies in our own solar system and many, many planets around other stars should have life, and our whole galaxy should just be teeming with life.
Because it seems at the moment we very much focus, as we touched on earlier, on Mars or on Europa is another possibility, probably because we're, again, as we touched on earlier, looking in a very Earth-centric way. Maybe there's water there, thinking about the way that life evolved on Earth. Would this help us to redouble and put more money into looking for the exotic biosignatures that you study and help that research sort of drive forward as well?
I think so. I think it would help a lot.
Yeah.
It may not help with the dollar. It may not help with the fact that money is slow, but I think it would help the whole commitment to the search for life as a main thrust of astronomy.
Yeah. And they get more people involved and interested in the field and looking at different things rather than just oxygen and water, I guess.
Right.
Awesome. So this is more, as we sort of come to the end of this is more how do I put this? An unscientific question. But how excited are you by this finding, and how long are we going to have to wait to find out more about this and get a conclusion to this? What's the timescale we're looking at here?
Okay. So you've switched from being a scientist to a journalist, because
exactly.
Journalist is like, we need to know what's the answer, and the scientist is like, is you have something interesting, you publish it so the world of scientists can help follow it up, and it could be months, it could be years, it could be a decade.
Yeah. This is why I left the question right to the end, because I know it's a little bit of a cheeky question, because the answer should be, I guess, as scientists, we just don't know. But obviously people want to have a little bit of an idea. So, I mean, maybe if I try to tease a little bit more out of you, how long do you think it's going to take people to shut off a lot of those chemical pathways, or for there to be potential viability of going to Venus and doing this collection? Is there any idea of a potential timescale on that, or is it very much up in the air? Well,
a lot of observations are a bit on hold right now because of coronavirus. Of course, many of the telescopes, including ALMA, have shut down.
Yeah.
That might take a while, but not too long, hopefully.
Yeah.
But you may have read in the news that Rocket Lab said that they are going to be launching a rocket to Venus in 2023. And that would be summer 2023. Now, Rocket Lab is a small rocket, but they're fast. They're a private company. It would be a privately funded mission. I'm proud to say I'm associated with that mission. And because I've been running my own mission study, and our teams have, informally worked together, right? And so they'll have a small payload, though. It's a small mission. So they won't be able to bring a microscope, and it's even if you bring a microscope, it's very challenging because there's a lot of things that are moving around, droplets, aerosols, things like that. But they'll be able to drop a probe down, a small probe, and it should be able to measure phosphine in the atmosphere.
Yep.
And measure other gases as the probe is a pretty short lifetime, but drops down through the atmosphere. So that's one thing.
Yep.
Yeah, that's probably our soonest chance. But NASA has been studying 2 Discovery class missions, expensive missions that would, they're in competition right now with each other and with 2 additional missions. And so those would go later this decade.
Amazing. So it might be a little bit longer than people in the press might want to wait. But in terms of the progression of science, in a decade, we might have an answer to this very fascinating, very fundamental, very sort of origins-based question. So very, very interesting. Professor Seager, thank you so much for taking your Saturday afternoon to go through this with me. Very, very interesting. I've learned a lot. Really, really excited to hear more about this as time goes by and we move towards clarifying this. Where can people go to find out more about the work that you're doing and to keep up with the developments on this story?
Well, I have a website called venuscloudlife.com.
Okay, so that's the one-stop shop for
you can go there and just
and
click around and see what's there.
Amazing. And any other links that you want to give people for personal or any further work related to this?
Sure, you can go to my website, saraseager.com, or follow me on Twitter at Prof Sara Seager, and Facebook too, just search for my name. And in general, I mean, I think it's everywhere now, so it won't be too hard to come across information, or just hopefully there's going to be a flood more articles on Venus.
Superb. I hope so, because it's been really, really interesting reading about it and finding out more about a planet that potentially slightly underserved, particularly in the recent past. So again, Professor Seager, thank you so much for taking the afternoon to go through this with me. I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully we can get you back and chat when there's a significant development in this. Thank you again so much. Have a lovely afternoon.
You too.
My pleasure. I want to know what you think, so let me know down in the comments section or over on Twitter. And if you'd like to hear and challenge more of my opinions on some of the world's biggest and most controversial topics, then remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I can't tell you how much it helps me out and how much more motivation I feel when you guys discuss and interact with the content. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being scientific. Thanks for being bad.